Welcome to Pathfinders, podcast series from RBC Capital Markets where we uncover the key trends and catalysts shaping the fast-moving world of biotech and pharma. I'm your host, Joe Coletti. Today we're continuing our broadcast from RBC's Global Healthcare Conference here in New York, and we're going to be focusing in particular on the development of therapeutics to treat cancers, speaking with our special guest, Lara Sullivan. Lara is president and CEO of Pyxis Oncology, a clinical stage biotech that aims to develop life-changing cancer therapies. As a biotech entrepreneur and advisor, Lara has leveraged her expertise in asset evaluation, portfolio management, and startup financing to raise nearly $500 million of capital from seed stage through IPO. So I want to start with maybe you giving us a little bit of an overview about Pyxis and what you're trying to do, your interventional oncology heritage or IO heritage, your primary focus on ADCs, and maybe talk a little bit about your priorities in the next 12 to 18 months.
Sure. So Pyxis Oncology, I think, is set apart because we have a passion for trying to tackle difficult-to-treat cancer types, meaning that we believe it's important to bring forward new science, new biology, addressing new targets. We're not about incremental innovation or marginal tweaks. And that's been sort of a consistent theme for us, whether it's been related to our immuno-oncology heritage where the IP originated or the ADC modality that we licensed in from Pfizer a couple of years ago. In both cases, the programs that we were pursuing were first in class. And in the case of our lead ADC program, it's a first in concept, meaning it's a new way of using ADCs. So that's been sort of our heritage. And our go-forward focus for the next 12 to 18 months is delivering the data. So our lead ADC program, we expect the data to come out in the fall of this year. That will then guide the next stage of development, which will likely be dose optimization leading into cohort expansion. So we get more specific around the types of cancers that our therapy will address. And then for our second program, our immuno-oncology program, that data is expected at the end of this year. That's also a first-in-class target. So that would also dictate, coming out of that data, what the next steps are for that program.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit more about how differentiated your lead program is? PYX-201, a novel ADC that targets the stroma rather than the cancer cell directly, and just how unique it is compared to the classic approach with other ADC modalities.
Yeah, so the ADC modality has gotten extremely hot over the last couple of years, I think, as we're all aware. We've seen a lot of deal making. We've seen a lot of great clinical data coming from ADCs. And all the ADCs that are approved, as well as every other ADC in clinical development except for ours, addresses targets that sit on the cell surface. Our target is a splice variant of fibronectin, which is a structural component of the tumor stroma. And the tumor stroma surrounds the tumor cell, and the overall tumor itself, has a boundary that contains the stroma and the tumor cells. So our thesis here is that by altering the nature of the tumor stroma, which provides nutrition, metabolic support for the tumor, you can dismantle the tumor. Just like, if you were to detonate a building, if you were demoing a building, you'd take down the basement, right? And the building would fall. The same concept here around targeting the stroma. So this concept was pioneered by Pfizer, where we licensed the technology from back in the middle of the 2010s. They licensed in the target from Dario Neri, who's a researcher in Switzerland, and he's been a scholar of the stroma for his entire career. The stroma and the tumor microenvironment have typically been identified as places for immuno-oncology therapies to work. And ADCs have tended to focus on cell surface targets, primarily because there had been a canonical belief, which is actually incorrect, that an ADC needs to address a target on a cell surface and be internalized, meaning engulfed by the tumor cell and then kill it from the inside out. And that's why you haven't seen any other stromal targets. But what we've shown through our preclinical work, what Pfizer showed before us and we've continued to advance, and which I believe our clinical data will show when we release it, is that conventional wisdom is just false. And you actually can address targets elsewhere in the tumor than the cell surface and be just as effective of a killing machine in taking down the tumor.
It's so innovative, and Just a quick follow-up on that. How advanced is the ongoing phase 1 clinical trial stage?
So right now we have been dosing patients in the phase 1 dose escalation trial since March of 23. So we're 14 months into the trial. We are at the later stages of dose escalation. We announced in March of this year that we were approaching the 8 mg per kg dosing level for our ADC, which is an unprecedented dose level for this linker payload component of our ADC, meaning other ADCs that are out there with an auristatin payload, which we have a modified version of it, have tended to cap their dosing levels out at 1 to 3 mg per kg. The precedent Pfizer HER2 ADC dosed in the 3 to 4 mg per kg range in its phase 1 trial, and it maxed out at 5 mg per kg. It was actually intolerable at 5 mg per kg. We had announced in March when we were starting the 8 mg per kg dosing that we had cleared 5.4 mg per kg. So there's something about this target and this mechanistic approach that may be allowing us to dose patients at higher levels, which could ultimately allow for improved efficacy and potency.
Maybe a slightly bigger picture question around this is, we mentioned Pfizer. How challenging is it for an early stage biotech firm to conduct complex phase 1 studies, relative to big pharma?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually something I think, we talk about a lot because we went public in 2020 with a number of other preclinical companies. And so there's, 20 or so of us that are out there with our phase 1 trials, which I think the market is not used to seeing phase 1 dose escalation trials. It's not as familiar with how to analyze those and read those as it is, phase 3 trials. So we have a learning curve in the capital markets around what these trials are powered to deliver, because it's not powered in phase 1 to deliver a statistically significant response rate. It's powered to show, is there a signal in this tumor and what dose level could you get to? So we have a baseline asymmetry, I think, with capital markets, nuanced understanding of phase 1 trials compared to pharmas who live and breathe phase 1 trials, who understand what a phase 1 can and cannot tell you. And then you have little companies like us who are trying to navigate, partnership opportunities with pharmas and then, accurately communicating information with the capital markets. And both of these groups see the same information, sometimes very different ways. And I do think that makes the communication and the so whats that come out of our trials that much more important for us to clearly communicate. I also think that what's right for the molecule sometimes might be a no-brainer in terms of how you might structure that phase 1 if it existed inside of pharma, because they have the resources to do broad tumor assessment. They have the resources to do, multiple PDX models to inform their clinical development. They have the resources to maybe get their arms around more, mechanistic studies that can predict clinical outcomes than we're resourced as a smaller company. The collective we, not just Pyxis. I think in the case of Pyxis, we were very fortunate because we took our asset from Pfizer, that they had done a lot of that for us. So we actually have a preclinical package that I think is, well above the quality of what you would tend to see for our peers who had to originate their own phase 1s. So the complexity, I think, is important for the molecule so that the molecule can tell you what it needs to tell you. But the challenge is boiling that down to clear sound bites, inferences, and so whats for the capital markets that are, monitoring on a given day hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials, and they just want to know quickly, what does this mean? What does this mean? So that's where I think it's hard for us sometimes.
Is it really just about continuing to explain this to investors in capital markets, continuing to be present, continuing to show up at places like this, at these conferences, so that you can articulate and explain this? Is there any other sort of secret sauce, if you will, to breaking through?
We talk about this a lot, like whether there's other vehicles of communication. I think absolutely the investor conferences are essential, and the monthly investor calls, earnings, even, this earnings that we put out today, we put a little more qualitative explanation of our mechanism in the press release than we normally, would do in the past. And I think that's because we saw it as another opportunity to communicate. We actually put images of 3 of our posters from the AACR conference. And again, you wouldn't normally put that in a press release, but it supported some of the narrative and the dialogue we've been having around the mechanism. And we felt, since we can't talk to everybody one-to-one at the same time, using the press release that way would be helpful. But I do think, especially when you have new target, new tumor biology, and a new mechanism, and you're a phase 1 program, there's a lot of areas of uncertainty and scholarship that you have to quickly explain. So repetition helps. I think, earlier this year, as we were going up the escalation steps, we got a lot of questions around, some of the safety insights we shared in March. Basically, the headline was, the March press release said, well tolerated to date. Good message, right? But then everyone wants the detail underlying it, and they assume if you're not giving it, that's potentially a negative. And so you have to do a lot of communicating to say, no, that's not a negative. This is a positive, and here's why. And so this earnings release today, we haven't gotten any questions really about safety. So I feel like the repetition of those messages is now set in, and now we can move on to other things about like the mechanism or what we think the next steps of development could be coming out of the data. So it's essential, yeah.
So I think there's a lot of lessons built in there to other companies when dealing with capital markets, particularly in areas as complex and innovative as this. I want to turn to you personally, but also talk a little bit about leadership and how your leadership has evolved. You have a very impressive personal background. We know you worked at Pfizer for a number of years as well. I'd love for you to just share a little bit of how you came to be where you are right now, but also want to talk about just how you've seen your own leadership evolve over time throughout your career and how you're sort of applying and putting into practice now at Pyxis.
Yeah, so I was never the person that had like a specific aspiration of what the next career step would be. I was always motivated by the business problem at hand, and frankly, two things. Was the business problem at hand challenging, and was I having fun? And if those two conditions held, then I was happy. And if either one of those wasn't holding, it was time to figure out, okay, what's the next thing? And so that led me to sort of different roles when I was inside Pfizer. And then that led me to biotech, because my transition to biotech came from stepping out of my day job at Pfizer, where I led the strategy and portfolio group for Michael Dalston at the time, to spending 2 years figuring out how to pull assets off the shelf from Pfizer and put them in a new business model, which became SpringWorks Therapeutics. So my transition to biotech came by founding SpringWorks and leaving with the assets. And then with Pyxis, I had the chance to do it again in a more traditional venture-backed setting. And so, each of those experiences had sort of meaty business problems to solve and were fun because I was learning new things, I was meeting new people, I was getting a chance to apply sort of, my critical thinking skills in different ways. So I never set out and said I want to be a CEO, but the CEO role ended up being the role that satisfied those conditions. And so I think one of the things I've learned, having been in the seat now for almost 5 years, is, especially as a biotech CEO, you have to be completely adaptable. Some days my job is more of a spokesperson, communicating.
Like today.
And other days it's actually almost like a project manager, going in deep with the scientists or the clinical team and making sure the right hand and the left hand are connecting and getting in the weeds that way. So some days it's to be more hands-on and more concrete and tactical, and other days it's to be more high level. And so I think that in this job, even more so than, maybe any analogous role I had in a corporate setting, you have to be agile, because every day it asks something different of you. And so that's exciting and fun. And sometimes it's super, super challenging because, you might feel like being a spokesperson one day, but you're really needed in the weeds that day. And you have to do it because, you can help the team come together, and they need that of you. And that's the best way you can kind of work with the whole team. And I think the way, our leadership team has evolved, I sort of joke sometimes that, biotech is one of the few professions that rewards you for getting older because you get pattern recognition, years of experience, you learn things, and then you know how to apply them to the next experience. And, at the same time, you want always young, innovative, fresh thinking. So you want a mixture of the both in your organizations. But in ours, we have very seasoned executives in our leadership team who've pretty much all cut their teeth in big pharma as well, where you can learn from the best of the best on the principles of drug development And I say that because there's no substitute for experience and knowledge. You could be a brilliant researcher with a great idea in an academic setting, but that doesn't mean you know how to put together an FDA briefing document. You just have to learn. And it's not a knock on your intelligence or anything. It's just an experience base. And so in a small biotech where you don't have the ability to get that wrong, you don't get a second chance, right? If you do the briefing book wrong, you've lost time, you've lost momentum. You need people who know how to do the briefing book right the first time. So our team brings years of experience in pattern recognition and also that shared passion to novel science. None of us in Pyxis want to be figuring out, how do we tweak this amino acid to make a linker on an ADC better? That's important if it helps translate to patient outcomes. But we'd rather say, what's the new target or the new biology that, we could apply our pattern recognition to solve these hard problems. And then I'd say we have a number of values at Pyxis, but the one that I'm the proudest of is it's called patience over ego. And so if you keep in mind always that you're doing this for the patient, it will often cut through some of the organizational things that, any of us face in our day-to-day jobs. Like if somebody's in a meeting and somebody else, commented on their area and they start to feel like, that was my area. Okay, patience over ego. That's your ego talking. The other person said it because it's for the benefit of the patient. And it can help just bring you back to, what's right and what's important. So team is that mixture of credentialed, knowledgeable folks. And then I think with sort of a shared vision around what they want to achieve and kind of a common cultural desire of how to work together.
You talked a lot about experience being one of the greatest teachers. So I wouldn't be working in capital markets if I didn't ask you a little bit about M&A, one of our favorite topics. But I'm kind of curious what your philosophy is around how you think about it and what your approach is.
So we were very fortunate that we raised a lot of money in 21 right before the downturn. So we had $320 million in our war chest, which was great because we needed it to get through, the preclinical work, to launch the clinical trials. And we have runway now through the end of 26. What we also saw during the downturn, while we were well-funded and a lot of our peers were not, was that there was great science that was available on sale. And it felt to me like Black Friday after Thanksgiving, right, where everything's super, super bargain priced. And so we said, if there's an opportunity to bring in technology that fits these criteria I mentioned earlier, that, could be transformative for patients, that we had the expertise to address and potentially could get us into the clinic faster than where we were because the capital markets looks for that, then that'd be a win-win for us and for investors. So we actually spent a good portion of the downturn screening and evaluating opportunities as buy-side M&A, that we were the buyer. What we found and what we learned through all that was that even when the deal thesis is there for pipeline mergers, you still have the challenge of the human elements of merging, cultures, and you need two boards to vote on things. And so there were a number of things we saw that were attractive that could have complemented our pipeline quite well, but the counterparty wasn't ready to do a deal. And then the tragedy of it was, 6 to 9 months later, many of them would call us back because they thought they could raise money and they couldn't. And several of them ended up going belly up. And, it was just a real lesson for how M&A, as much as it's deal thesis, analytics, I think rises and falls on the people and, right, their ability to participate in a deal. So I think for players like us, probably those bargain days are gone because, everyone's stock's risen a bit and maybe not as much as we all want them to have risen to, but they're not the dark days of 22. But I think for pharmas, it's still bargain hunting. Yeah. And so, and I think having been on the inside of pharma, and when my last role, I worked a lot with the business development groups, biotech, quote, de-risking for pharma is an absolute, viable channel of great science to go into pharmas. So I think with still depressed stock prices historically, there's still a supply of potentially great science for pharmas to acquire at a discount in their language or their measure, maybe not mine. They might see a $2 billion acquisition as a bargain, and I'd be like, that's amazing. So I think that there's still the appetite there, but I also think for pharmas, Some of them, really need to identify that strategic fit, the gap fill. And then others will sort of follow the breadcrumbs of exciting science. And I say that because at the AACR conference this year, this was the first time there was an inaugural strategic meeting 2 days before the science started. And they invited, a dozen of the top pharmas. So all the big names were there with their lead clinical people and business development people. And they each one of them walked through their pipelines and talked about their BD strategies. It was the best meeting I'd been to in years because it was chock full of insights. Merck said, here's what we look for. And Pfizer said, here's what we look for. And Genentech says, here's what we look for. And many of them look for specific, gap fills, but others are just, hey, if you've got a great mechanism or great biology, come talk to us because that's what we focus on. So I think that appetite is still very much there based on even what I heard at the AACR conference.
It's really interesting. We have time for one more question. When you think about investors, you talked a little bit earlier about what's difficult to translate maybe, or you have to do some extra work to translate some things to the capital markets, whether it's about you, whether it's sort of bigger picture. Are there things that you'd like to convey to capital markets that you think they should be paying more attention to? Can be about you, can be broader. I think I know what part of your answer might be, but I kind of want to get your perspective on that.
So I think one of the things that I had been surprised to learn or observe over the last year, and maybe for capital markets experts like you, it's not a surprise, but the nuanced risk tolerance differences amongst different investor groups, meaning, as we raised our pipe in the spring, we found some investors could get really comfortable with the new target, but not so much the new mechanism, meaning the stroma. And then others who are like, wow, the stroma's cool, but I wish you had a de-risk target. And then we found the sweet spot of investors who are okay with both. And I hadn't fully appreciated those nuances of risk assessment and tolerance in the investor community until we really got deep into the pipe. Because when you're preclinical raising money, you think, oh, being in the clinic will cure everything, but it doesn't. It's just it cures some of it because you've gotten into patients, but you're still in a risk assessment mode by the capital markets community. So I think that what I would love to see is and it's probably two parts. It's in the investment community and in the biotech community, more of a meeting of the minds of getting comfortable around investing in areas of new biology and new targets and what some of the clues are that can give people comfort about that risk. So, for example, we're often asked, like in March when we put out, a positive or a tolerable safety profile, and we got a lot of questions. Well, how do we know that it works and your safety is not tolerable because it's not working? And, we'd say, well, we have waiting lists at every site. There's 1,500 phase 1 trials going on in oncology in the U.S. and Europe. We have waiting lists at every site. I don't know. Investigators probably aren't going to put their patients on a waiting list if they think nothing is happening. So it's a clue. It's not the hard fact that the investor wants, which is tell me that this works, and which we can't do until we get data. But it's a clue that's actually pretty powerful. So what I would love is, as we have more of these early stage trials in the capital markets, that the reading of the clues, people get more comfortable the reading of those clues, and maybe we as biotechs get more comfortable giving some of those clues, because we just can't give data that's intermediate or in the middle of a trial. It's not responsible because you're still gathering information. So you don't want people to take insights away, positive or negative, for something that you're waiting on 50% of your data. But I can tell you, in our case, we've had investigators with waiting lists nearly the entirety of the trial. So the fact that we're now a year in at higher dose levels and they still have patients on waiting lists, maybe in the early days they were doing it out of, okay, this is cool, this is novel, let me get my patient on. Well, now we have 14 months of data that they've seen and they still have waiting lists. So investment community, figure out what that means, because I can't tell you.
I think that's a great message to end on. Lara, it's been a real pleasure having you on. I hope you'll come back, and we wish you best of luck.
Would love to. Thank you so much. This was great.
That's all for this episode. Thanks again for listening to Pathfinders in Biopharma, brought to you by RBC Capital Markets. Please remember to subscribe to get more great content and be alerted about future episodes. This episode was recorded on May 14th, 2024.
This content is based on information available at the time it was recorded and is for informational purposes only. It is not an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation, and no recommendations are implied. It is outside the scope of this communication to consider whether it is suitable for you and your financial objectives.